All right, so 2 days ago, today's Friday, so 2 days ago on Wednesday, the news broke that all of a sudden Step 1, one of the biggest major USMLE exams that we take in order to continue our career path, and the exam that I would say also had the biggest impact on our future as doctors was changed to being pass or fail. Now, of course, everyone has a bunch of different opinions on this. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. However, I do feel that our class, and by our class I mean the current class of 2023, is the most impacted by it because we are the year directly preceding it. And with that, it also means that like people who do end up taking like gap years, or people who are MD PhDs, now you're gonna be put in like different situations where different things matter. But in addition to that, I also think that like there are a lot of other things that it impacts as to like now what schools look at, how it impacts like other things such as like IMGs, DOs, how it impacts just like the whole entire step process in general, or like how now that like more attention or less attention is now focused on like the academics of your first 2 years, what now is all important. So lots of different opinions. So today I'm gonna hear the opinions of 3 of my classmates, people you've already met: Abdo, Delano, and Uche, on what exactly their opinions on this is and how they think this is all going to impact our future, how it will impact our class, whether or not they're opposed or with the change, and etc. So here we go. All right, so like I said, Uche, Delano, and Abdo. So first question to ask, okay, let's explain what exactly STEP is for everyone watching who is not exactly sure.
So Step 1 is the first licensure examination that medical students have to take in medical school, usually taking right after you finish your second year of medical school. There's also a Step 2 exam, which you take between your third and fourth year prior to applying to residency programs. And you also take Step 3, usually during the middle of your residency program, which is one of the last of the 3 licensure exams that you have to take. And Step 1 originally was like a design to basically assess students' competency in foundational science concepts, and it was technically just to make sure that you had a solid foundation in that respect before moving to clinical rotations. But what happened was that residency program directors started to use that objective score as a way to kind of filter through applications given their busy schedules, and now it ended up being a metric that was basically used to determine whether a student can enter a certain specialty, which altogether I think the medical community was pretty much agreeing on the fact that a Step 1 score, which is not really assessing anything in regards to your clinical skills, was not the most accurate predictor of who should be able to do a certain specialty versus another person.
Perfect, thank you. So Delano, who is currently in a surgery interest, can you tell us why exactly STEP or your STEP score is important to you, and how that would differentiate between what you go into based on what you end up getting for STEP?
All right, so as Uche mentioned, STEP is pretty much what residencies use to determine, if you can handle the level of material in residency. But I feel like it's super stressful, but I feel like we should have a score because it puts a lot of stress on everything else. It puts a lot of emphasis on everything else if we don't have a score. If it's pass fail, then letters of rep becomes so much more important. You have to do better in the clerkships, which are already pretty subjective. So I feel like we should have a score.
Okay. And Abdo, so Abdo, how has just like the entire looming thought, or just the thought that STEP is coming, how has that actually like influenced you, your first 2 years, your study habits, and how do you think now, knowing like if you were part of the class that it would be pass and fail for, how do you think that it would actually like impact you or like your first 2 years and etc.?
Well, in that aspect, I definitely be taking like research and extracurriculars more seriously. Like currently, I'm not really like, I want to say like the most, what's the word? Like, you know what I'm talking about? Evolved. I wouldn't say that. I'm playing. Involved. Facts. Yeah. So like, I'm mainly just like studying, getting my grades up and stuff like that. So when it comes to extracurriculars, I know that they're important, but like to a certain extent, if I like, for example, if I get an extra 5 points on the step, that'll be better than any leadership experience. You know what I'm saying? So like that's my mindset right now. But if it were reversed like that, then it would be flipped. What's the point of studying extra hard if it's gonna be pass fail? So I might as well just like put in the extra work for like volunteering and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's like you could say, like, to play devil's advocate, there's like another argument to it. Like, do you really think that like an extra 5 points to the step would make you a better doctor than another person? Or maybe like a leadership experience or more volunteering, better letters of rec. So, there's like two sides to it, but I mean, that's my my thought process.
Perfect. All right, Uche, what's your take on the fact that STEP is not pass fail? Your opinions, overall thoughts?
I mean, I believe there's a lot of pros and cons. I think the biggest pros is something that I think everybody does agree on, like Abdo said. Like we said, that the score on step 1 to me doesn't seem to be directly correlated with a student's potential to go into a certain specialty. I think that people can argue that step 1 may be a great correlator to how you're going to do on your like subsequent step exams, like step 2 and step 3. But like Abdo said, a 240 versus a 245, like to me, that's not an accurate predictor or a great way in which to measure students' abilities. I think that step 1 is also just is an exam that where if you have a bad day or you're sick or maybe you're not a good test taker, like for them, the con is that one score is going to determine their future forever. So for me, like the pro is that you basically got rid of a metric that was kind of ruining and it was a detriment to the mental health of the students here at the school, not the school, but in medical school. But I think the biggest con, and some of the cons have to do with the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty and not enough knowledge about what is going to happen for the future. But I mean, the biggest con to me is simply that it just shifts the pressure now to step 2, which is maybe a better indicator of a student's ability to be able to do clinical practice. But the pressure shifts because between 3rd and 4th year, your step 2 exam is going to be weighing way more than it used to. And what if you don't score well on that? You only have a couple weeks basically to start figuring out what specialty you would actually successfully match into. So I think it ends up just shifting the stress again. I think it's really up to residency program directors to start finding other metrics to measure students. And like Abdo said, other things besides school start to matter more, and my only concern is that we start reverting back to the college thing where people are just racing for extracurricular activities and just doing things for the sake of trying to get to the next step. And for me, medical school has been great because people just do what they're passionate about, and it's at the end of the day, your school grades should say everything about your academic potential.
Yeah, you have anything you think you want to add to this?
Oh man, Uche pretty much hit the nail on the head. But as he said, for the first 2 years, like pretty much all everyone talks about is step 1. Like people, don't even watch the lectures; they just focus on board materials to prepare for step. So in a sense, that's good. But like if it becomes pass fail, no one cares about it anymore. And as he said, it shifts to step 2. And it becomes the same thing, except that if you do bad, you have less time to figure out your future, So I don't think it's as good in that scenario, but it does decrease a lot of stress.
Okay. So overall, would you say you are for or against the change? Or do you think this is a step in the right direction, or would you rather things have stayed the way they are?
I would say it's a step in the wrong direction. Just because, as I said, it's simply going to shift the stress to step 2. It's going to be the same thing again in a couple of years. So I think we should keep it how it is. Okay. And have a score for step 1.
I do think it's a step in the right direction though, because we are moving away from the emphasis of step determining everything, which is the one thing that I think everybody for many years have been saying. Like step 1 has no correlation and should not be the metric used to determine the student's ability to be able to match into a specialty. So I think that we are moving in the positive direction. Where everybody is having issues is there's so much uncertainty. Like we were talking about, does step 2 become the new step 1? How are you going to know what you're competitive for if your step 2 is the only thing you're using and you're doing that right before your applications? What happens to prestige? Is prestige now everything, unlike what people were saying before? There's a lot of factors that has not been explained by residency program directors, obviously, because this decision came out recently, but I think that a lot of the negativity towards this decision has been that there's just been no explanation to what is going to be the substitute objective measure to determine where students should place in regards to a specialty or a part of medicine.
All right, and you, Abdo?
Oh, wow.
Would you say you are for it or against it? And your reasons why?
I'm gonna be honest. Haven't really looked too heavily into it. Pretty much because low key, this might sound kind of apathetic, but it's not really gonna affect me. You know what I'm saying? So I
Nah,
really,
that's facts though.
it's low key. So I haven't really looked into it like that, but it's hard to tell. I feel like it's gonna suck for like the school to still have like graded classes, because like that's gonna be stressful. Thank God we're pass fail though, but. Yeah, you got some nice kicks on, bro.
Oh,
What
thank
the hell?
you.
You want to show? Damn, bro. All right.
Shout out to the new kicks.
Go ahead.
But yeah.
But, yeah, but I mean, I don't know. They both have good arguments. I don't know. Sorry.
So at the end of it, I do think our class is the class that is the most severely affected by this, because while one can say that, okay, we're still going to be graded. So we are currently all MS1s, and which means that after we take STEP, the next year after we take STEP would now change to being pass fail. So we would be the last class which would receive a numeric score, which also means that while it is uncommon for students to take like multiple gap years unless you are like an MD PhD, it is very common for students to take like either research years, whether they take earn a second degree, and etc. So for those students in our class who are taking those like extra years in order to earn other things, while they have a numbered step per se, they'll be graduating and applying for residency with people who now have pass-fail steps. So what are your thoughts on how that would affect those people, and if that would be like a fair metric to compare them? Do you think it's more advantageous for those with scores versus those without?
And what happens to medical students? Like
That also.
now when you're applying to medical school and they're trying to determine an applicant, like, does MCAT really matter at that point now? Like, should that be the primary factor to determine who should be a medical student? Because if we're trying to de-emphasize step one and trying to say like that should not be the overall, let's scrap that whole thing. I'll say the biggest, the people who should be the most concerned to me are international students who are trying to apply to America, just given the fact that that one thing that used to be the thing that could help separate themselves from the rest of the pool and really help them stand out is now removed. So for them, the challenge is now returning back to America or coming to America to practice. I think that challenge has become even greater. So for international students, it's a big concern. I also, like I said, think that for medical students, it's a big concern, especially ones who are now applying, because I don't think that these top medical schools will have as much waitlist movement anymore, because most people start going to schools that are cheaper because it's just it's the safest economical choice. But I think now people are going to start putting prestige over everything, because at the end of the day, without step one, the better school you go to, the better connections you'll make, and probably the easier it is to connect with people at different residency program directors.
True.
But regarding getting into med school, I think that's a little bit of a different situation, because like everyone knows med school is difficult, right? Mm-hmm. And so there has to be some measure of intelligence to determine who can handle the coursework. And also you can take the MCAT like several times, STEP not so much. So it's a completely different ballgame, I believe.
Yeah, that's true. What I will say, well, you have anything to add also? What I will say, in my personal opinion, which is an interesting point that you said, I do think that the MCAT, although there used to be the correlation or the thought process that the MCAT was able to directly correlate to how well you did on STEP, I do think that the MCAT is now going to be way more important and way more emphasized for pre-meds who are trying to get into medical school than it used to be. And the reason I say that is because now that prestige matters so much, medical schools really need a way to separate between all of their applicants. They need a way to determine, okay, this applicant is better than this applicant. And I think that at the end of it, as like primal and barbaric as it seems, is just gonna go back to, okay, who's the better student? Like if you're a top 20 medical school and you know that like the prestige of your school matters so much more now, I think that the impact you put on the MCAT itself, or like your actual grades in undergrad and maybe your involvements or how perfect of a student you were, now means that much more, because everyone's only going to be trying to get into top tier schools with the fact that like now you can no longer differentiate yourself with STEP. Same as IMGs and DOs, I do think that rather than accepting a Caribbean school or a school somewhere else, I think people would now rather put some more gap years in between themselves in hopes of trying to get into an American-based school, because they no longer have like the equalizer that they did. back when STEP was numeric.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that this change is going to be interesting because I also wonder how medical schools will respond. Will they shorten their preclinicals now, given that the preclinical doesn't have as much emphasis as it used to? So, like,
a good point.
you know, schools have started to shorten their preclinicals anyway. They started to shift when they're taking STEP. Like, many schools have already started thinking about making those progressive changes. The question is whether more schools are going to continue to make those changes in order for them to accommodate for the fact that Step 2 is now more important.
You have anything you would like to add?
Right, go right here. So.
Nah, that's true. But yeah, what you were saying about IMDs and DOs, I definitely agree. Also agree with the whole entire impact thing. But there is the argument that the impact could now mean less because now that like schools are becoming pass-fail, STEP is becoming pass-fail. So then it's there is like the school of thought that like grades in and of itself, like metrics are becoming less important and that there should be different ways of like qualifying people. So while I personally believe that pre-med grades or grades coming into med school are going to be more, a lot of people do believe that now they're going to try to shift away from those. But the only question is, what would they look at?
I mean, I don't think it's, I mean, like I said, like, you're right. All schools at all levels are now trying to de-emphasize the importance of metrics. Like, there are schools no longer needing the SAT and ACT scores. Like, they're not emphasized as much anymore. Like, the whole MCAT, like the MCAT used to be the one and only thing that mattered, and now it's like your extracurriculars and your activity outside of school, your background, those things can trump your MCAT score. So you're right. Like, the whole education system is trying to move away from metrics, given, you know, a lot of the controversies that come with trying to do well in school, and you've seen that with the cheating scandals and stuff like that. So I do believe that it's good to be moving away from the emphasis on metrics, but I also do believe that metrics is really the only way you can accommodate for the number of people who are applying to things. Like, residency program directors don't have the time to be looking through 300 applications. How are they going to determine who's the better applicant? Well, if they know people from certain schools, if they're more familiar with certain people across the country, then it's more likely that they're going to end up getting interviews because you're just more likely to choose someone you're more familiar with than anybody with a pass on their step one.
Or programs you're more familiar with.
Or more programs that you're more familiar with. Like I said, I think it will change the way in which people are selected for residency programs. What I think is the biggest issue right now is that there's just too much uncertainty and that a lot of questions still need to be answered from INCUS, which is the committee that decided to do this. And we just have to wait and see how residency programs are going to adjust as well.
But back to the earlier question that we didn't get to fully answer, how it exactly affects. So two sides to this. Not only how it affects those of us who aren't applying to the match with our year, but also how it would affect, let's say, the class under us, who now potentially, and the class under them also, who could now potentially be applying to match with, while they have a pass and fail score, with people who now also have like numeric scores. So I guess on both sides of the coin, how do those people who have numeric scores applying against pass and fails feel? And then how do you think like those with pass and fails would feel applying against people with like numeric step 1 scores?
So I think that's where a lot of the uncertainty is going to come in, like people that are applying like directly after this change, because you don't know what residencies are looking at anymore. Like, you don't know if your score will still matter, you don't know if it won't. So like, that's where you're just stuck in a predicament where you just have to hope your situation works out, but it's tough in that case, to be honest. I don't know how they would deal with that.
I mean, I think it's complicated, like you said, because, you know, you're comparing a numeric score to a pass-fail, outcome. I think that's really hard to do. I do think if you do really well on step 1 and you still have that numeric score and you're comparing to someone who has a pass-fail, there's more security from a residency program standpoint to be able to take that student and interview them and know that, you know, you can trust that their score at least was valid and that it was worthy of needing an interview compared to someone who's just a pass. But at the same time, I also do believe that programs will just shift away from even looking at the scores anyway and just stop putting emphasis on it altogether, because it is true, you can't really compare a pass and a score. If you do bad on the step, then it's good, because then you're not going to be limited to your number. But if you did really well on step and you're a great test taker, then you're just going to end up having to do the same and bring the same energy to step 2. So I don't think it's that big of a deal. I just think that, you know, like I said, we have to see how residency programs respond to that.
Yeah, kind of what he said. I'm gonna be honest though, it's gonna be tough for like people with like the mid-tier scores, like a 230, maybe like a 240 and below, that like maybe they don't have like the research experience or the volunteering or the involvement that someone with a pass has. So I mean, their score will be all right, but compared to all the other stuff, they'll lack in, they'll pale in comparison. So that's gonna be tough for them. But shoot, that might be me. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? So you never know. But yeah,
That's true.
But at the end of the day, I think standardized exams are always going to be a thing. They're needed. Maybe they shouldn't be as overwhelmingly important as they are, but they're always going to play a factor in you getting into any, residency or program.
thanks.
Yeah, no, that's true. So, any last thoughts?
Be patient. Don't rush to judgment, and I think you just have to continue to have that same mindset. I don't think that your mindset should change whether it's pass or fail versus a numeric score. I think you just need to keep that same energy, continue to do well, and trust the process.
Yeah, I say just keep doing what you're doing. Whether you have a score or not, work just as hard as you were trying to get into any residency you wanted to. Like, it shouldn't really make a difference.
Yeah, I agree with that. By the way, those Air Maxes, bro.
Oh, yeah, actually.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah, just got
clean,
them.
bro. I might have to. What size are you, bro?
Not your size. But I definitely agree with all of them. As someone who was thinking of taking a year to get a second degree, this change definitely did cause me some hesitation, in which now I am trying to consider whether or not this would be in my best interest, how it would feel to be paired against someone who has a pass score while I don't. So all these are like thoughts. However, I do think this is a good step in the right direction health-wise. As far as like the mental sanity of a med student, as far as like no longer having to like go crazy trying to study for steps and not being as stressed. But then again, the stress will come in different ways, because now you're not stressing over grades, but now you're stressing over trying to get like 60 research publications and trying to be involved in everything and get to know everyone. So although some would argue that like these are better stressors than grades, like, okay, now you're stressing to try to be a good doctor and get as much experience as possible and be in network and be as socially connected. But
Essentially the same thing.
it's essentially the same thing. And with it all, I mean, for the class, next year's class and the class after us, they don't really have a choice, but I do think that like our class is in that like precarious position. We have a friend who is an MD PhD, so while she'll have a numeric score, she'll be applying 5 years later to residency programs, where you can say like for our class, even for like those like people who do take a year, they'll have more of a like, I guess, a fair comparison. But like, I think by her time they'll have fully moved away from like numeric scores and they'll be strictly on pass fail. So what exactly would that mean then? But a lot of unanswered questions regardless. We might as well call this the first take on STEP by the MS1s.